a vanished bride, and a mirror hiding more than reflections. Welcome to Detective Noir. I am your host, Daniel Mercer. I love seeing this community grow. Comment where you're listening from today. Your voices make this journey unforgettable. Let's dive in. On a raw afternoon in late November, when the brown fog lay like a sodden blanket along Baker Street and the lamplighter went by with his pole lifted into the gloom like a priest with a taper, Dr. Watson found Holmes in an attitude of profound indolence which, in him, heralded anything but inactivity. He had allowed the fire to sink low, sat cross-legged upon the hearthrug, and with half-closed eyes sent a thin ribbon of smoke towards the mantel, where it wreathed about the Persian slipper that dangled from the corner. His violin, open-mouthed as a sleeping creature, lay across the arm of his chair. Between his fingers, he balanced a card of stiff white pasteboard, and at his feet an open tin of bath salts perfumed the room faintly, incongruously, with the smell of violets. Watson had barely shaken off his ulster when Holmes spoke without turning his head. "If you will shut the door quite firmly, my dear fellow, you will save our caller from the delusion that we are a household who advertise our business to the draft." "Our caller?" said Watson. Holmes inclined the card so that the firelight struck its raised lettering. "The Honourable Mr. Percy Armitage," he read aloud, "of Handsome Place, Mayfair." He flicked the pasteboard with a long forefinger. "A man who has been driving about the city these 2 hours. Note the rounded fraying at the lower right, where he turns such cards in his pocket. An anxious man, whose nails have been gnawed to the quick. A fastidious man for all his agitation, for this is a card freshly cut and his kid glove, left hand, is dusted at the cuff with powder from a lady's dressing table." Watson smiled. "And from this you make a caller instead of a correspondent?" "The perfume," said Holmes, and permitted himself the smallest of sighs. "Violet bath salts, Watson. He left the tin open on my rug. He has been here 5 minutes. He went down again to the hansom to fetch something because, listen," there came a hesitant rap at the door below, a murmur of apology to Mrs. Hudson, and the sound of a foot that halted on the stair as if the climber had suddenly lost his courage. A moment later, our door opened to admit a young gentleman whose costly attire would have better suited a ball than the grimy afternoon. He bore upon his arm a square object swathed in a linen cloth, and his face, the pale, resolute face of a man bred to privilege and little exercise, had been pulled awry by a strain which he strove unsuccessfully to master. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he said, and his voice broke on the name. "I am Percy Armitage. If I intrude, pray forgive me, but I was told, everyone says, that you will find here a thread where the world sees only a tangle," Holmes finished for him, with that mixture of dryness and not unkindly impatience which often soothed more than any overt sympathy. "Pray be seated. Dr. Watson, you already know. You have brought with you an exhibit. We shall come to it presently." Mr. Armitage sank into the chair opposite the fire and pressed the cloth-wrapped thing to his breast as if it were a sensitive creature that the cold might harm. "My affianced wife has vanished, Mr. Holmes," he said, "vanished in the very act of becoming my wife." Watson felt a start go through him. In all his years with Holmes he had heard every variety of the dramatic, yet it was the manner of this gentleman's declaration, stripped of ornament by genuine terror, that struck him. Holmes steepled his fingers. "You will begin with the facts as they occurred, and you will permit me to interrupt you where the sequence is in doubt." "In doubt." The young man gave a short, miserable laugh. "It is all doubt. We were to be married today at St. Michael's at noon. There was some fuss at my mother's. She is a woman whose nerves exact a strict ritual. And so, to keep the peace, Miss Julia Redmayne, consented to dress in our house at Handsome Place and to drive with my sister and 2 bridesmaids to the church. She went upstairs at 10:30, and at 11 I sent up a bouquet of white lilies. Julia is fond of them." Holmes shifted. "White lilies," he repeated, and his eye passed in a momentary glance to the open tin on the rug. Yes, there was a bustle of feet, laughter, her maid, the bridesmaids. "I confess I wandered about the house like a soul on the Day of Judgment. At 11:15, my sister Flora came down to say the veil sat wrong and that they would be 10 minutes more. Then at 11 precisely, Miss Redmayne asked, so Flora told me, for a moment alone. She wished to compose herself. She dismissed the girls and the maid. She said she would ring when she was ready. "And she did not ring," said Holmes. "She did not." After 5 minutes, the maid tapped, received no answer, tapped again, and then fetched Flora. The door was locked on the inside. They called. There was no reply. They grew alarmed. They sent for me. I came with the house carpenter. We forced the lock, ruined it, I fear, and entered. The room was empty. Watson could not refrain from an exclamation. Holmes's face had become quite still. "Empty," Holmes repeated. "No other exit?" "None," cried Armitage. "It is the corner chamber at the front, the windows on the square. But they are high casements. The shutters were barred. The sash was fast. There is a small communicating closet for gowns, empty. Another door gives upon the upper landing. That is the one we forced. The fireplace? Bricked up these 50 years, my mother says. She detests drafts. And the key? Within, in the keyhole." The gentleman's hands tightened upon the wrapped object. "There is one thing more. It is why I brought this." He rose, came forward, and laid the parcel upon the table between us. With fingers that shook, he unfolded the linen. A square of polished glass looked up at us, an old mirror in a dark frame carved with wreaths and knots. The surface was crazed delicately, as ice is on a winter puddle. "This was upon the dressing table," he said. "It belonged to Julia's mother. She would have none other to dress by. When we entered, this thing stood with its face to the wall, and there," he touched the lower left corner, "there was a smear on the wood as if it had lately been grasped by a hand that was not over clean. Mr. Holmes, I do not pretend to superstition, but there is a story of this mirror in the Redmayne family. They call it the bride's glass. It is said to have stood in the chamber of a lady who fled her wedding in 1817 and was never seen again. Watson is not a nervous man, but the tale told in that dim room with the fog pressing its face to our panes like some beggar out of a nightmare had an effect which I could not wholly resist. Holmes, however, smiled with a weariness that did duty for scorn whenever the preternatural was advanced, as a cause where a dust rag and a foot rule would do. If Mrs. Redmayne of 1817 had understood the uses of a measuring tape, said he, we should have been spared many silly narratives. Pray sit. Your account has several points of interest. The room, you say, was in such order as to show that no struggle had occurred? In order? Yes, save for the veil upon the floor. It was as if she had cast it there, and there was a scent stronger than lilies, something sweet and powdery. Flora said it was Julia's habit to dust her hair with orris root. I noticed, should I speak of trifles? I noticed upon the lower rail of the dressing table a tiny streak of some grey substance, and there was upon the left of the mantel a mark, as if a boot had scraped it. No, not a boot. A heel, perhaps? Holmes's eyes shone for a fraction of a second. All things are trifles until they are not, he murmured. Continue. We searched the house. There was no trace. At last my mother, she abhors scandal, sent for the police only when the minutes had made a mock of hope. Inspector Lestrade came. He has men still at the house. But he is convinced of the most monstrous absurdity, which is that Julia repented at the last moment and contrived some clandestine escape with, he would not name him, but he meant a lover. Sir, I would stake my blood on her. There has been no lover. There has been no deceit. She is proud and, yes, too high-spirited for the peace of those who would govern her. But deceit, no. Lestrade pointed to the locked door and spoke of keys and cords and droll contrivances. He would have it that she left by the window, though the very paint on the sash is unbroken, and there are no marks in the square below. He hinted at bribed servants. I cannot bear this. I came to you. Holmes had risen during this speech and was pacing with quick, noiseless steps, the smoke from his cigarette describing broken figures about his head. He stopped to examine the mirror, lifted it, balanced it upon his palm as if to judge its weight, and set it down again, this time not quite straight upon the table's edge. A strip of light along the lower frame gleamed and was gone. You did wisely, he said. The police are honest fellows and sometimes useful, as a walking stick is useful. But when the thing to be solved is of a peculiar delicacy, one must take up a scalpel. You will take us at once to Handsome Place, Mr. Armitage. Armitage sprang up. At once? At once, Holmes repeated. But before we go, Watson, observe our friend's glove. Observe our friend's glove. I confess I had not noticed it until that moment. The kid of Mr. Armitage's left glove was faintly dusted with a pale powder. In removing the mirror's wrap, he had left a trace upon the linen also, a faint, regular crescent as of a fingertip drawn through fine dust. "Orris root," said Holmes, sniffing the air near the glove. "And something else. Civet, for which I thank the perfumers of Jermyn Street. Now a question or two. This mirror, did Miss Redmayne's maid dust it?" "Constantly. Julia was particular to fault. But this morning, when the bridegroom is to see her at last, oh, forgive me, no, she dismissed the maid. Has Miss Redmayne any relation or friend with a turn for theatricals, mechanical devices, sliding panels and the like? Some doting uncle who collects curiosities. Her uncle, Mr. Ephraim Redmayne, deals in stained glass and ecclesiastical furnishings. He has a warehouse by the river in Millbank Court. He is, how shall I say it, a man who would contrive a candle to burn backwards if the church would pay for the novelty." Holmes's lids lowered. "Ah, and when was this mirror brought to your house?" "Last night. Mr. Redmayne sent it in his own van with 2 men. Julia wished it set up only for this morning. It had lain, she said, in a cupboard for years." Holmes exchanged the burned-down stump of his cigarette for a fresh one and struck a match with a sudden, almost petulant energy. "Watson," he said, "you will oblige me by putting that glass a trifle nearer the fire." "Gently, Mr. Armitage, do you know your servants?" "I have known them all my life." "Then you will not object if I know them a little better." He glanced at the clock. "We shall go." Armitage caught up the cloth to wrap the mirror once more, but Holmes stayed his hand. "No, leave it. Mrs. Hudson shall keep guardianship of the bride's glass for an hour. If there is mischief in it, as there is in most of the things with romantic names, it will not be mended by removing it from my sight." He stood, drew on his coat, and with a flick of the wrist sent the last coil of smoke to its death in the grate. Then he turned to me with that air of brisk, almost boyish resolution, which came to him at the scent of the chase. "You observed, Watson," said he, "that our client's glove bears Orris, but the linen shows arcs regular, as the beat of a metronome. You observed, too, that lilies, if left long in a close room, yield an odour which can stifle a canary. Add to this a maid dismissed, a veil upon the floor, a heel mark not of a boot, and a family tradesman whose business is to teach stone and glass to imitate miracles. The case has the merit of being impossible. I detest nothing so much as the merely difficult." Watson followed him to the door. "And you think—" "I think," said Holmes, "that a mirror which can hide a bride is a mirror which has been taught to tell a lie. Let us go and make it speak the truth. The hansom took us down through that sullen, smoky afternoon, the horses' hooves ringing upon wet cobbles, and the red eyes of the lamps winking awake along the streets. Percy Armitage sat opposite, his hands locked and his gaze fixed upon the window, as if he expected at each corner to see a white figure step out of the fog and raise a veil. Holmes, with his chin sunk upon his breast, seemed sunk in reverie. Yet I knew that he was storing away every trifle. The hour, the scent upon our companion's cuffs, the grit that splashed from a passing dray and lay upon the rug between our boots. When the cab swung into the tidy elegance of Mayfair and drew up before a house whose brass and stone had the chill gleam of lifelong propriety, he touched my sleeve with the lightest pressure. "Courage, Watson," he murmured with a ghost of a smile. "We go to ask polite questions of a very impolite fact." We mounted the steps. Above us, at a corner window, a blind stirred as though some careful hand had let it fall in haste. In the hall a butler, mortified and defiant, faced us with the particular rigidity that belongs to those for whom catastrophe is an insult. Somewhere in the house a woman sobbed, the sound quickly smothered. The smell of lilies, sweet, sickly, persistent, came down the stair like a presence that had chosen to remain when all else had gone. Holmes removed his hat. "Inspector Lestrade is above?" he asked. "In the ladies' chamber, sir," replied the butler, with a glance at Mr. Armitage that blamed him for having brought the world to the threshold. "Then to the ladies' chamber," said Sherlock Holmes, and, with that, the hunt began. Lestrade received us with that mixture of relief and injured pride which the official mind always exhibits when Providence condescends to send it assistance from an unauthorized quarter. He stood with his back to the dressing-room fire and his notebook open, as if to interpose both heat and authority between himself and the singular vacancy which the chamber presented. A bridal wreath lay upon a chair. On the floor a film-like fall of tulle, drifted by some draught that had since expired, and in the grate blocked with brick as Armitage had told us. A spill of white ash hung upon the lips of the hearth as frost hangs upon a hedge. The air was a potpourri of sweetness that oppressed the lungs. Lilies first, then that dry, cool note of orris, and under all a thickness which I could not at once name, but which set the head to throbbing. "You see, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade said with a briskness too carefully assumed, "there are only the ordinary ways in or out, and none of them taken. The young lady must have walked out like other folk. When people want to vanish, they usually manage it." "When people want to vanish," Holmes answered, dropping on one knee beside the inner escutcheon, "they seldom leave the key obligingly behind them. Pray do not move, Watson. There is a dust here of an instructive kind." He drew from his pocket a small lens and a penknife, and with the blade lifted delicately from the inner plate, a pinch of matter no thicker than breath. He set it upon the back of his nail and peered. "Graphite and tallow," he murmured. "Very workmanlike. The key turns sweetly if one feeds it so. And see." He indicated the polished bevel of the lock with his forefinger, a fine crescent scratch on the lower quadrant. "Someone has turned this key from the outside with a looped implement, a ribbon of steel perhaps, thrust through the keyhole and caught in the wards. The trick is old. I taught it once to a jail treasurer who repented too late of his curiosity. Your locked room diminishes, Lestrade." Lestrade sniffed. "If she was in the plot, sir, she could do it as well as any thief." "If," said Holmes, and left the word upon the air like a pinned moth. He crossed to the window. A heavy damask curtain had been looped back, and the sash, coated with that glary paint which is the fetish of respectable households, showed the unbroken skin of long immunity. Holmes touched it lightly with the pad of his thumb, and then with the edge of his knife. "Untouched within the month," he said. "The shutters were barred." Lestrade pointed to the inner bolts. "Fast when we entered. There's a balcony on the floor above, but no way down." Holmes's attention had gone to the mantel. He bent, examining the left corner where the marble met the supporting jamb. There, no bigger than a coin's rim, showed the dull smear our client had spoken of. He applied the lens, then measured by that curious habit of his, first with the span of his hand, then with the distance between the first and second knuckles, a mark of rubber, no, of leather's edge, narrow-pressed, not scraped, he observed, and his eyes travelled upward to the shelf. And upon the shelf a faint dimple, as from the weight of a hand steadying itself. Suppose you are a person of light build in a dress that hampers climbing, and you stand upon this ledge to reach, what? Not the chimney. There is no entry there, not a bell rope. It is opposite. You reach, he had gone to the dressing table. The lower rail just above the knee bore a faint streak of grey. He moistened a finger, touched it, and brought it to his nostrils, not dust of the common sort. Stone meal, very fine, with a suggestion of lamp-black. Such a mixture is used to dress the backs of glass when one wishes to kill reflection and make a surface read as opaque. He straightened, and for the first time that day, a livelier light came into his features. He looked around at the blank wall where the mirror must have stood. "You removed nothing from this table?" he asked Lestrade. "Nothing, sir." "The gentleman there took away a mirror." "He said it was his lady's." Holmes's brows rose by a hair. "So he did. Mrs. Hudson will polish its conscience for me. Meanwhile, the bride's glass has left behind it a confession. Pray attend, Watson. Let us reconstruct." He placed himself where a woman would sit to dress, his long fingers indicating an absent frame. His gaze fixed not upon us but upon the space where a face would have looked back. "You are a bride. You have dismissed your attendants. You desire a moment's composure. Your veil lies ready. You turn your glass not to the wall as it was found when we saw it, but perhaps a trifle aside, to avoid the glare from the window. You reach with your left hand, there to steady yourself, and you put your right on the mantel corner to what? To raise yourself? To watch something behind you?" He looked over his shoulder at the communicating closet. Or to press. He broke off and went to the closet. It was a narrow cabinet for gowns, papered inside with rose-sprigged chintz. Holmes ran his fingers along the back, then along the floor at the junction of skirting and board. Presently his nail hit upon a headless screw sunk almost flush. He smiled, but only with one corner of his mouth. "Installed last week," he said. "The carpenter." Armitage, who had hovered on the threshold as a man may hover at the mouth of a tomb, in which he half expects to find his happiness laid out, answered in a whisper. "We had men in to mend a cornice in the drawing-room. My mother swears no one touched the bedchambers. Your mother, Holmes returned, will forgive me if I put less faith in oaths than in screws. He pressed with the heel of his hand against the backboard. It did not yield. No easy play here. Yet the stone meal says that a glass has been handled, and the mark at the mantel says a light person balanced and reached. What did she reach? He stood silent a full half-minute, his head bowed and his eyes half-closed, as if listening to some counsel which no other ear could hear. Then he moved with sudden decision to the bell cord and rang. The maid, a slight pale girl with red-rimmed eyes, came trembling. "You are Alice Pratt," said Holmes without introduction. "You powdered your mistress's hair with orris root. You were dismissed at 11:15. You waited outside the door after, out of sheer good sense. During that time, did you hear anything besides the ordinary motions of a lady at her toilet? A sound like a pane touched with a fingernail, very light, or a dull thud as of something hollow moving?" She stared at him as if he had repeated her own thoughts. "There was, oh sir, there was a little sound, like a mouse in the wainscot. I told myself it was that. It came from the dressing-table side, and just before Mr. Percy came up, we smelt something queer, sharp-like under the flowers." Holmes nodded once. "Thank you. You have justified your wages." When she had gone, he turned to Lestrade. "Ether," he said, masked by lilies and civet. Enough to blur the senses of an overexcited girl, not to strike her down, unless given in a higher dose, which I do not yet believe. And a small movement of wood where no movement should be. Lestrade, to do him justice, did not bluster. He only shifted his stance. A secret drawer, then. Traps and toys. If she chose to be fetched away. If she chose, Holmes repeated with that same pinning of the word, she would not have left the veil like a footstep. "Leave us a moment." To my surprise, Lestrade complied, marshalling his men with a stiff nod. When the door had closed, Holmes beckoned Armitage nearer and spoke in a tone that was almost gentle. "You love this lady?" "With my life," the poor fellow said. "Then you will listen. The mirror came last night from Mr. Ephraim Redmayne's warehouse at Millbank Court. 2 men brought it. You will give Lestrade their names. You will also provide me with the carpenter who mended your cornice and any man who entered this room in the last 7 days. Lastly, you will borrow from your mother, who detests drafts, the plan of this house as it was before the fireplace was bricked." He tapped the blocked hearth with his toe. "When I know how your father's builder cheated the east wind, I shall know how another man has cheated you." He moved to the door and then, as if struck by an afterthought, crossed once more to the dressing-table. Beneath it, near the skirting, lay a pin of curious shape, longer than a common hairpin, with a flattened head, pierced by 2 small holes. He lifted it delicately. "Not English," he said. "A fitter's pin from a French joiner's kit. Mr. Redmayne buys his church glass on the continent. He is not the only man who imports novelties." Armitage made as if to speak, but Holmes's raised hand checked him. "Courage, sir. Your bride has not fled. She has been borrowed. Borrowed." The word came raw from the gentleman's throat. "For how long and for what price we must discover. What's in your hat, Lestrade? You will keep your men from meddling with this room as you value your eventual report. I go to ask a few questions in Millbank Court. If Mr. Redmayne is as ingenious as I suspect, he will not be at home. But his benches may be more communicative than their owner." As we stepped into the corridor, the long, low house gave back the hush of a church at service. Halfway down the stair, a figure drew aside into shadow. I caught the line of a woman's cheek and the glint of rings on a rigid hand. Holmes did not look. Yet when we reached the hall, he said, in that voice of his which could be air one instant and steel the next, "Your mother, Mr. Armitage, is unaccustomed to disobedience. Pray tell her that for this afternoon only, her habits must yield to my necessities." He bowed with a grace that had nettled many a great lady into compliance, and the butler, conquered by form where feeling had failed, let us out into the wet November. Holmes lifted his face to the gloom as if to take its measure. Then very softly, as a man might address the city itself, he said, "We shall find your mouth that swallowed her, and when we do, London, you shall spit her out." The cab rattled us southward into that quarter of London where the river's breath drifts sour with tar, wet rope, and the long sigh of steamers idling by the wharves. Percy Armitage sat rigid and mute, his gloved hands clenched together in a mute prayer that found no words. Holmes beside me leaned forward with his long hands crossed upon his stick. his eyes not on the world beyond the glass, but on some inner map that overlaid it, each street and turning fitted to his purpose. The rattle of the wheels, the hiss of rain against the hood, and the dim blur of gas lamps in the fog were the only accompaniment until we drew up in Millbank Court. The place was a warren of mean brick buildings, their windows obscured by grime and the faint hues of coloured glass stacked behind them. A single lantern swung over the door of Redmayne's warehouse, casting a blur of saffron across the puddled cobbles. Holmes stepped down lightly, his gaze sweeping from the glistening horse trough to the shadows beneath a stair, and then up to the roofline where a gull beat its wings against the mist. He rapped smartly at the door, and when no answer came, tried the latch. To my astonishment, it yielded. We entered a cavernous hall where the air was thick with dust and the metallic tang of lead solder. Long benches ran the length of it, littered with chisels, clamps, panes of glass stenciled with saints and angels, and the dull gleam of molten lead cooled into strips. Holmes passed swiftly from one table to another, pausing to lift a shard, to test the weight of a clamp, or to examine a length of timber upon which curious grooves had been cut. His movements were noiseless, precise, like those of a man turning over pages in a book he already half knows by heart. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, gesturing to a section of the bench where a frame lay half assembled. It was fashioned not to hold glass, but a thin reflective plate backed with canvas and braced by iron pins. Along one side ran a concealed hinge. A mirror such as this may show a face one instant and an aperture the next. A lady sits to dress. She sees herself. A pressure applied from behind turns the glass. What confronts her now is an open space, masked by her own reflection a moment before. Our bride's glass is no mere heirloom, it is a contrivance. And behind the mirror? I asked, leaning closer. A cavity sufficient to admit a person if the carpentry be clever. See here, the inner struts are strengthened with steel. A man with patience could make a passage of it, temporary, portable, easily fitted into the wall of a chamber under pretext of repair. Our Julia Redmayne was not spirited through solid air. She was drawn through her looking-glass as Alice was in the tale, though to a darker land. At that instant a sound startled us, a foot upon loose boards at the far end of the warehouse. Armitage half rose, his face pale. Holmes stilled him with a hand. He stepped forward into the gloom, and his voice, cold and unhurried, cut the silence. "Mr. Redmayne, I think. A pity your glass should prove more transparent than you intended." From behind a stack of timber emerged a tall, spare man with iron-grey hair and the stoop of one long wedded to a workbench. His eyes, sunk deep beneath the brow, glimmered with a wary intelligence. He carried a small lamp, which threw his features into cruel relief. "Mr. Holmes," he said with unexpected calm, "I might have known. You ferret where others blunder. Well, you find me in my workshop. What do you want?" Holmes did not answer at once. He was turning the lamp's light upon the object Redmayne had carried in his other hand, a narrow box, stoutly built, its sides drilled with vents. "And what?" Holmes asked softly. "Does one carry in such a box? A pain or a passenger?" The man's lips tightened. "You speak in riddles. On the contrary, you have constructed a riddling device, an abduction by illusion. Miss Julia Redmayne was persuaded to sit before your treacherous glass. A turn, a draught of ether, and she was gone. Where have you taken her, sir?" Redmayne's hand shook so violently that the lamp flame wavered and sent grotesque saints dancing on the rafters. He set it down upon the bench with a clatter. "I have taken her nowhere. If she has disappeared, it is not by my doing." "Then," Holmes said, "you will not object to our searching your premises." At that, Redmayne's composure cracked. He glanced sharply toward a door at the rear of the hall, a glance so swift that another might have missed it. Holmes saw. He moved with such suddenness that the man gave back a pace, and I followed, my heart quickening. Holmes flung open the door. A narrow passage led to a stair descending into shadow. From below came a faint odor, sweet, heavy, cloying, the unmistakable scent we had known in the bridal chamber. Holmes's nostrils flared. "Orris root, lilies, and civet, Our Lady has passed this way." Redmayne sprang forward as if to block us, but Percy Armitage, with a strength born of desperation, caught him by the arms and held him fast. We descended, Holmes leading with a speed that made the stair groan. At the bottom we found a low chamber, whose walls were lined with crates. Upon a trestle lay draperies of white silk, a wreath crushed beneath them, and beside it a phial half filled with pale liquid. There was no sign of Julia. Holmes examined the phial, uncorked it, and held it to the light. Ether, as I suspected, but not enough to have been used freely. A threat, then, rather than a dose. She was brought here, made to wait, and then removed. Armitage's voice was hoarse. "Where? Where is she now?" Holmes looked about him, his gaze pausing at a stack of crates marked with foreign characters. "These bear the stamp of Rotterdam. Mr. Redmayne imports his goods by river. See the moisture upon the boards, they were shifted but recently. Our Lady was conveyed out not by road, where police might spy, but by water. There will be a lighter at the wharf." He turned to Redmayne, who now sagged in Armitage's grasp, his face grey with defeat. "Sir, whether you are accomplice or tool, you have lent your hand to a deception whose purpose I will learn. Miss Redmayne is alive. Of that I am certain. If you value your liberty, you will tell us at once to whom you delivered her." The man's mouth worked, but no sound came. Holmes's eyes, cold and inexorable, fixed him as if to bore through his skull. At last he muttered, "I cannot speak." "There are others, men with whom it is death to meddle." "Then," Holmes said, "you will find that silence is sometimes the shorter road to the gallows. Watson, we must to the river. If fortune smiles, we may yet overtake them before the tide turns." We hurried back into the night. The fog had thickened, swallowing the lamps until each glimmered like a faint star drowning in murk. From beyond the warehouses came the wash of the Thames against the embankment and the distant hoot of a steamer. Holmes drew his coat about him, his face alight with the fire of the chase. "Come, Watson," he said. "The game has entered its next move. London has tried to swallow a bride, but I do not intend she shall rest in its throat." The river lay before us, broad and black beneath the dripping fog, its surface broken now and then by the lantern glow of a passing barge or the white hiss of steam from some unseen vessel. Holmes paused upon the wharf, his keen gaze sweeping the shadowed outlines of moored craft, the hunched silhouettes of lightermen moving among coils of rope and dripping chains. Percy Armitage stumbled to his side, half frantic, but Holmes's arm restrained him with quiet firmness. "Control yourself, sir," he said in a low tone. "The Thames is a chessboard, and if we move rashly we shall lose our queen. We must learn whether our adversary has carried his prize upstream or down." He stepped lightly to the edge where a cluster of bargemen were smoking by the shelter of a shed, their caps glistening with rain. Holmes addressed them in the gruff accents of a working man, asking whether any unusual cargo had been loaded within the past hour. They looked him over with suspicion, but one, a fellow with a crooked mouth and eyes sharpened by suspicion of authority, nodded toward the farther pier. "A covered lighter cast off not 20 minutes past," he muttered. "2 men with her and a woman aboard. They said she was poorly, kept her head wrapped in a shawl, went down river with the tide, took pains to ship quiet-like." Holmes pressed a coin into his hand. "That will be enough," he turned to us. "We are in time, Watson. The tide favours them, but so does steam favour us. Come." We hurried along the embankment until we reached a small police launch moored beside a watchman's hut. Lestrade, who had followed doggedly with 2 of his men, produced a warrant with ill-disguised triumph. Within moments the launch was sputtering into the current, its lantern swinging wildly as it cut across the dark water. Percy Armitage crouched beside me, his face pale as death, while Holmes stood at the prow, his figure rigid, his eyes fixed upon the murk ahead. The Thames was alive that night with traffic, barges creeping like hulks, steamers whistling mournfully in the fog, and here and there the faint stroke of oars. Yet Holmes seemed to divine a path among them, guiding the boatman with curt gestures, listening more than seeing. Once he raised his hand and the engine fell silent. Out of the darkness drifted the faint creak of wood on water, the muffled beat of oars in deliberate rhythm. "There," Holmes whispered. "A covered lighter, keeping close to the Surrey bank." They hugged the shadows to avoid notice, steady and no noise. We followed at a distance, our lantern doused, the launch gliding like a ghost upon the oily tide. Presently the darker bulk of the lighter loomed ahead, its shape half lost against the warehouses that lined the bank. A tarpaulin had been rigged across the deck, and beneath it moved the indistinct outline of a figure. Percy gave a strangled cry, but Holmes's hand was at once upon his sleeve. "Not yet," he murmured. "We must know to whose keeping she has been delivered, else we save the lady only to lose the game entire." The lighter nosed into a narrow inlet where the water lapped against rotting piles. A small landing lay there, with a flight of slippery steps leading up between blank warehouse walls. As we watched, a lantern gleamed from the shore, and two men appeared, cloaked against the rain. A signal passed between them and the lighter's crew. The tarpaulin was lifted. For an instant, by the wavering light, I saw a woman's figure, shrouded, motionless, her head drooping as if in sleep. She was carried ashore between them. Holmes's breath hissed softly. "The bride. Mark well their faces, Watson. That one with the scar across his cheek. He is an old acquaintance of mine, by name Caleb Fisk, a river hand with more knowledge of smugglers' routes than any map of the Thames could boast. The other, broad-shouldered, heavy of jaw, is his brother Samuel. Both are in the employ of whoever commands this enterprise. And note, they conduct her into the warehouse, not away upon the river. The cage lies there." He turned to Lestrade, whose features were tense with excitement. "Circle them quietly. Place your men at the back. But make no move until I give the word. The lady's safety is the piece at stake. A single alarm, and they may silence her forever." We disembarked some distance down, moving along the dripping quay with muffled steps. Holmes led us by a narrow alley until we reached the rear of the warehouse. A faint light seeped through cracks in the boarded windows, and the murmur of voices came from within. Holmes bent close, his ear against the wood, and his hand upraised for silence. "The Fisk brothers," he breathed, and one other, deeper-voiced, commanding, "Hush, they speak of payment. Ah, they name him. The patron waits at St. Swithin's dock. That is our destination, Watson. They mean to keep her here until the tide turns again, then transfer her to the patron's care." "And who," I whispered, "is this patron?" Holmes's eyes glimmered in the darkness. "That, my dear fellow, is what we are about to discover." He withdrew, signaling us to follow. In another moment we were back at the quay, where the launch lay ready. Holmes spoke in quick tones to Lestrade. "Leave 2 men to watch the warehouse. If they stir with the prisoner, delay them at all cost, but without noise. The rest will follow me. We must be at St. Swithin's dock before their master." The launch shot forward once more, cleaving the sluggish tide. The fog thinned as we drew eastward, and the outline of the city rose, spectral, against a moon blurred by cloud. Holmes stood at the prow again, silent, his cloak whipping in the damp wind. At last he turned to me, his voice low but edged with steel. "We are near the heart of this mystery, Watson. The mirror, the ether, the carpentry, mere instruments. The true hand lies behind. When we see the man at St. Swithin's, we shall know why a bride must vanish upon her wedding morn." He laid a hand upon my arm. "And pray heaven, we find her before he takes possession." St. Swithin's dock lay in a crook of the river, where the warehouses huddled like old men around a brazier, their bricks sweating with mist and their windows blind. The launch's engine coughed twice and fell to a murmur as we slipped into the lee of a timber pier. Holmes motioned the boatman to kill the lantern, and we drifted beneath the black rafters, while rain needled the surface beyond. Above us upon the quay the echo of hooves loosened into the night and came back again, softer as if padded. A carriage, lamp-shaded, rolled to and fro like a shark that has smelt blood, but waits the wound. Holmes touched my sleeve and pointed. A brougham had drawn up with its panels swathed in oilcloth, and its crest neatly masked by a strip of black leather. The coachman sat forward in a low collar, the line of his back stiff. The door opened only a fraction, and a man stepped down with care. Narrow-shouldered, wrapped in a dark Inverness cape, his hat pulled low, a muffler concealing the lower part of his face. He moved with the economy of one much practiced in keeping his parts close together, and carried a cane, whose silver head showed for an instant the odd outline of an ecclesiastical mitre. He stood under the angle of the warehouse wall, where the rain could not touch him, and rapped once with his cane upon the door. Holmes's breath stirred against my ear. "The voice we heard through the boards," he murmured. "Listen." It came faintly, but the dock catches whispers as a shell catches the sea. The door opened a little from within. A head thrust out. There was the mutter of men who would parley without being overheard. The newcomers' tones were low, precise, contemptuous in their very courtesy. On the next ebb. Not before. You will be paid the balance when I see the package. We want it clean, growled a second voice, Samuel Fisk by its thickness. No trouble at the shore. It will be cleaner, returned the first, if the lady is sensible. Keep her quiet. A fortnight is all that is required. After that, the license lapses. Passion's cool. Arrangements may be revisited. The cane clicked once upon the flags. The door closed as carefully as the lid of a jewel case. The narrow-shouldered man stepped back into the brougham, and it moved away without a jolt, like a cat leaving a dairy. Armitage had crept forward in spite of Holmes's hand and would, I think, have rushed the door then and there if Holmes had not caught him by the cuff and borne him bodily into the shelter beneath the pier. In the dimness his face was a pale mask streaked with rain. You heard? He choked. They mean to prevent your marriage without the inconvenience of scandal, said Holmes, with that flat evenness which, in him, often concealed the bolt of a plan. There is the motive, not love, not jealousy. A legal interval. Watson, do you mark the cane head? Churchly, I whispered. A bishop's mitre? An heraldic jest favoured by certain ecclesiastical furnishers and their solicitors. Our man keeps the trade close, as such men do when money is its sacrament. You saw the coachman's boots, silent as a sexton's. I have seen that livery pass Lincoln's Inn in wet weather. Come. We followed the brougham at a distance, the launch taking advantage of the bank's curve until the carriage, grown bold where houses were decent and policemen frequent, rattled away up a street of commerce, turned, and halted before a sober door whose brass announced, with small pride and large propriety, B.L. Aunton H. Avers, Solicitors. A single lamp burned within. The figure in the cape entered without knocking. The door closed with that same careful finality. Holmes's hand made a brief note in his pocketbook. No more than a mark, but I knew, as I have often known, that it was a nail-driven, Septimus Blount, he said softly. Trustee to the Redmayne estate these 10 years, if my memory serves, and counsel to various parishes who purchase glass and altar gear from Mr. Ephraim. The chain grows visible. Watson, a tradesman who can contrive a miracle for hire. River hands who know every blind turn of the Thames. A solicitor whose business it is to make time a commodity. Now to snip a link while they polish their consciences. He signalled the boatman, and we slid once more into the wet blackness. At St. Swithin's we found Lestrade's men where we had left them. They had seen no movement at the warehouse, and had kept their posts like good pins, useful, blunt, and apt to bend if strained. Holmes did not praise them. He only nodded and went straight to the door, which, a little while before, had opened its pursed lips to our patron. He tried the latch. It held. The key within grated against something soft. He produced from his sleeve a slip of tempered steel, no broader than a ribbon, worked it delicately, and the lock yielded with a sigh. The interior was long, low, and smelling of ropes left to rot. A lantern, turned down to the merest breath, made a small island of colour upon the floor. Holmes shut the door behind us and stood listening. So intent was his posture that even Armitage's breathing grew quiet. Presently he crossed to the wall opposite the wharf side and knelt. The boards there showed the faintest troughs where something heavy had been dragged not once, but many times. He put his palm to them, lifted it, and held it towards me. Warm, he said. They brought a crate through here within the half-hour. A crate, I repeated, remembering the vented box Redmayne had carried, with air holes, the same pattern of auger as at the workshop. He moved along the line of the wall, tapping with the bone handle of his knife, until the sound changed from honest timber to a hollower note. He smiled without mirth. There is your wharf miracle. Help me, Watson. We levered at a portion of skirting cunningly let in, and a panel came away with such reluctance as an old habit shows when found out. Behind it, a narrow dumbwaiter shaft descended to a cavity level with the river. Within the cavity, upon runners greased with tallow, stood a long crate fastened with 2 bolts like the lid of a gun case. Holmes laid his hand along its side and his face sharpened. Still warm, he repeated. They meant to load at the ebb. Blount came to chaffer. The men went to drink their courage. If Providence is ever to forgive my sins, she may do it now. He drew the bolts, lifted the lid, and we looked down. I confess I flinched. The interior was lined with sacking that smelt faintly of lilies. There was a small pillow at one end, and a glass file rolled in the angle where the crate's floor met its side. But there was no human occupant. Only a woman's glove lay there, white kid small, and beneath it a handkerchief marked JR tied hastily about a thin scrap of card. Holmes took up the card and held it to the lantern. Upon it a tally had been scrawled in pencil, Bay 3 SW, 2:15. Holmes's teeth clicked once. St. Swithin's, Bay 3 at 2:15. The second ebb. They have not shifted her yet. Either they kept her elsewhere in the building when we watched the river, or the crate was a feint to test the water. Armitage had sunk upon a coil of rope with the glove clutched against his breast as though it pulsed. "For God's mercy," he whispered. "Is she alive?" Holmes stooped again, lifted the pillow and sniffed. Ether, trace only. No heavy dose. The fabric holds warmth. The tallow upon the runners has not skinned. And hark! We held our breath. From somewhere beyond the inner wall, very faint, irregular, like the wing beat of an imprisoned moth, came a sound. Tap, pause, tap, tap, then silence. Holmes's eyes in that dimness were points of light. He set his ear to the boards and moved along the wall by inches, guiding himself by the intermittence of the tiny sound. At a place no larger than a prayer book, he stopped, ran his fingers across the planking, and found a nail-head set, like the headless screws in the gown closet at Handsome Place, just shy of flush. "Not Morse," he said half to himself. "The random courage of a stupefied prisoner. She is near." He looked round once, swiftly measured the distances, and spoke with a rapidity that brooked no resistance. "Lestrade, station a man at the door to Bay 3 and another upon the wharf. Admit no soul at 2:15 who is not wearing my face. Watson, the lantern higher, so. Mr. Armitage, you will stand by this shaft and, if I call, be ready to steady a weight lowered by rope. We shall take their stage before the players arrive." He slid his knife beneath the edge of that unassuming plank, and as he levered it up, the warehouse gave a small wooden groan like a sleeper disturbed. The tapping ceased. Holmes's mouth bent, and there was in that slight change of line more ferocity than in a shout. Courage. "Miss Redmayne," he said into the darkness beyond, and his voice, calm iron, utterly sure, seemed to travel through the wood as air goes through gauze. "We are here, and we do not intend to be late." Holmes's knife worked patiently at the plank until a line of pale air showed between its edge and the wall. He pressed his shoulder to it, and with a sound like a sigh, the board gave way. Beyond lay a narrow recess, black as the inside of a coffin, the damp breath of the river seeping through cracks in the stone. Into that darkness Holmes thrust the lantern, and its glow revealed a figure huddled upon a pallet of sacking. Julia Redmayne stirred at the light, her eyes half-closed, her hair disordered, her lips moving as if to form words. A hand rose feebly, and the ring upon it gleamed, the token of her betrothal. Percy Armitage gave a cry that was part relief, part anguish, and would have flung himself forward. But Holmes checked him with a glance. "Gently," he said. "Too sudden a shock may undo what the ether has not." He stooped, slid an arm beneath the girl, and with a strength that belied his thin frame, lifted her into the lamplight. "See, Watson, the pulse is weak but steady. No lasting harm." I took her wrist, confirmed his judgment, and felt the faint beat quickening under my fingers. Holmes laid her in Percy's arms, who pressed his face to hers with a broken murmur of devotion. For an instant, the raw intimacy of it seemed out of place in that mouldering den, yet it struck even Holmes into silence. Then his manner hardened again, all tenderness folded away. "Watson, revive her as best you can. A few drops of brandy will serve. Lestrade, close that panel and stand guard. We have recovered the pawn, but the game is unfinished. The master does not yet know he has been robbed." I produced my flask, and within minutes Julia's eyes opened fully. She looked about in bewilderment, then clutched at Percy with a shudder as memory returned. "The mirror," she whispered. "It turned, and I was taken. Oh, Percy, I thought never to see you again." Holmes bent to her. "Madam, you are safe. Your courage has been remarkable. Can you recall aught of your captors, voices, names?" Her brows drew together in effort. "They masked me with a cloth, sweet and stifling, but I heard one say the lawyer waits, and there was a man with a scar who smelled of tar and smoke. They said I should be kept until the papers were signed." Holmes's eyes glinted. "Just so. It fits. That will serve." At that moment a shout rang out from the quay, followed by the scuffle of boots. Holmes darted to the window slit. As I feared, the Fisk brothers return, and earlier than we wished. Into the recess with the lady, Watson, and be ready. Lestrade, your men must show their worth at last. There came the splinter of the outer door. A lantern flared, throwing grotesque shadows across the timbers, and the rough voices of the rivermen filled the warehouse. Quick now, get the box out, our patron waits. Holmes stepped from the gloom into the circle of their light, his face calm, his figure drawn to its full height. The box is empty, gentlemen. You arrived too late. The effect was electric. Caleb Fisk cursed and lunged forward, but Lestrade's men closed upon him. His brother swung a length of chain, catching one constable across the shoulder, but I myself, with more zeal than grace, struck up the weapon with my stick. In the confusion, Holmes had slipped behind them. A moment later, Samuel too was disarmed, his wrists locked in iron. The warehouse rang with their oaths until Lestrade's voice, shrill with triumph, silenced them. Take them to the yard. They'll sing another tune before the magistrate. Holmes ignored the noise. He was crouched again at the open panel, examining the interior with his lens. Note, Watson, the sacking, the ether files, the tally card, all laid ready to feign a lawful cargo. This is no crime of passion, but of contract. The lady was to be detained until her inheritance fell void, and then disposed of, perhaps quietly. He straightened, dusting his hands. We have the instruments and their workmen. Now we need only the hand that wound the clock. Julia, recovered enough to speak, whispered, My uncle Ephraim, did he know? Holmes regarded her gravely. He provided the tools. Whether he grasped their use entire, I cannot yet say. But the solicitor Blount, his hand is certain. He must have arranged the marriage settlement to fail if you did not appear at the altar. He counted on time and silence to do his work. Percy's arm tightened about her. Then we must go to him at once. Not so, said Holmes with sudden sharpness. If we accuse without proof, he will wriggle through law's net as easily as he slipped into his brougham. No, we must draw him where denial is useless. For that, I shall need your cooperation, Miss Redmayne. Do you feel equal to a little courage? Her chin lifted, pale but resolute. I owe you my life, Mr. Holmes. I will do what you ask. Holmes's smile was thin. Excellent. Then we shall give our solicitor his bride, though in a manner he did not anticipate. At dawn we return to Handsome Place. The mirror shall stand once more in your chamber, and Mr. Blount shall be invited to witness what it reveals. There, Watson, is where the snare shall close. The constables hustled the Fisks away, their curses dwindling into the fog. Holmes extinguished the lantern, leaving only the dim glimmer of river light through the cracks. We guided Julia and Percy back toward the launch, their steps faltering yet determined. As the craft pushed off and the tide took us, I saw Holmes at the prow again, his profile set against the mist. There is a flavor to this case, he said quietly to me, more bitter than most. It is not greed alone, but the cold arithmetic of law bent to villainy. A mirror turned into a door, a bride into a ledger's entry. Yet the same glass may also serve as a trap, and in its reflection we shall see the true face of her betrayer. And so we sped up river through the thinning fog, the first pale light of morning, trembling upon the water, carrying with us both the rescued bride and the certainty that the most perilous act of the drama was still to be played. The dawn was a sullen thing, seeping through a sky the colour of tarnished pewter, as our launch nosed back into Westminster's reach. Holmes had not stirred from the prow since we left St. Swithin's dock. He stood with chin sunk and eyes half closed, as if sleepwalking upon some mental path too narrow for the rest of us to tread. Percy Armitage held Julia close, his coat drawn about her against the damp, while I did what I could with brandy and a strip of lint to restore warmth to her hands. By the time we gained the embankment and a cab, her colour had returned, though her voice was still a whisper. Holmes broke his reverie only when the cab turned into Baker Street. A brief halt, he said, to set a few pieces in order. Mrs. Hudson's gasp at the sight of Julia, pale, exhausted, leaning upon Percy's arm, was hushed by Holmes's curt reassurance. He carried the bride's glass back to the centre of the sitting-room, as one might replace a bishop upon the board after removing a pawn. He examined the back again, running his finger along the rim where the stone dust clung, then drew a quick sketch in his notebook. "It is precisely as I thought," he murmured. "A frame hinged to conceal a recess, so that one seated before it may be drawn away. Ingenious, but not unique. Such tricks have amused conventicle magicians for years. Blount and his accomplices merely adapted it to commerce. Watson, a message to Scotland Yard. Bid them keep the Fisk brothers apart. They will betray each other faster than any jailer's threats. As for Redmayne, let him stew until Blount betrays him with silence, Percy demanded almost hotly. But why delay? Why not denounce Blount this very hour? Holmes's expression softened only slightly. Because accusation without demonstration is a feather in the wind, Mr. Armitage. We need the weight of proof. A solicitor of Blount's cunning will wrap himself in parchments and precedents until the law itself is stifled. No, he must be shown in the very act of possession, his hands upon the stolen goods, the lies stripped from his tongue before witnesses he cannot cow. That is why the mirror must play once more. Julia, leaning wearily upon the arm of the chair into which I had guided her, looked up with sudden steadiness. You mean to use me as bait? Holmes inclined his head. I mean to use the villain's certainty against him. He believes you still hidden beyond reach. If he learns that the mirror has worked its trick again, that the bride is lost anew, he will come to gloat to secure his advantage, to hold in his own hand the proof of your absence. And there we shall close the snare. Her lips trembled, but she did not flinch. Then let it be so. I will endure one more hour of fear if it ends this nightmare. Holmes's glance at her was one of rare admiration. You have the spirit of a soldier, Miss Redmayne. Rest now. At noon you shall be strong enough to play your part. By mid-morning we were again at Handsome Place. The house, with its brass polished and curtains drawn tight, seemed outwardly unchanged, yet within hung the hush of scandal deferred. Lady Armitage, proud as carved marble, descended upon us in the hall. Her eyes flickered from Julia, pale but erect beside Percy, to Holmes, and her lips pressed into a line of icy disapproval. My son, she said coldly, this is unseemly. Until matters are explained, the young lady cannot be received here. Holmes intervened with a bow that contained more irony than grace. Madam, explanations shall be abundant before the day closes. Meanwhile, I must beg the use of your daughter's chamber. Certain repairs must be made to its furnishing. You may attend as witness if you desire, though what you will see may chill even your composure. Without awaiting her answer, he led us upstairs. The chamber stood as we had left it, the veil upon the floor, the lilies sickly in their vase, the faint odour of orris lingering in the curtains. Holmes directed that the mirror be placed once more upon the dressing-table, its back to the wall. He examined the closet, the skirting, every nail and hinge, then nodded in satisfaction. All is ready, he said. Now we wait. Now we wait. He dispatched a note by runner, addressed to Blount and Havers, inviting Mr. Blount to Handsome Place on the pretext of finalizing the interrupted settlement. He cannot resist, Holmes explained. He will come armed with papers, prepared to insinuate that the lady has fled. When he finds the mirror turned to his advantage, he will betray himself. Watson, you will conceal yourself in the closet. Lestrade, you and your men will station below, ready to ascend at my signal. Percy, you must hold your temper until the mask is torn away. Noon tolled from a nearby steeple when wheels ground upon the gravel outside. Julia's hand clenched Percy's, but she stood her ground. We heard measured steps upon the stair, the dry cough of a lawyer rehearsing his dignity. Then the door opened and Mr. Septimus Blount entered. He was as Holmes had sketched him. Narrow shoulders, close-held frame, cape damp with mist, hat removed to reveal a skull-like brow. His eyes swept the room, resting with apparent surprise upon Julia, then narrowing with suspicion. My dear young lady, he said smoothly, we had feared you indisposed. How gratifying to find you recovered. His gaze shifted to Percy, then to Holmes. But surely this gathering is irregular. Matters of property and contract require the calm of chambers, not the heat of sentiment. Holmes smiled faintly. On the contrary, Mr. Blount, property and sentiment are curiously entwined here. And perhaps the mirror will explain. He gestured toward the dressing-table. Blount's eyes flickered. For a fraction of a second, something sharp and covetous passed across his face, then was gone. He advanced, fingers resting upon the frame. This trinket again? A pretty heirloom, no doubt. But surely we need not— He broke off. The mirror, by some sleight of Holmes's hand, had shifted upon its hinge. The frame turned, and behind it yawned the narrow recess. Empty but eloquent, Blount's breath caught. He turned sharply, and in that instant Julia, coached by Holmes, swayed as if faint. and Percy leapt to catch her. The lawyer's eyes gleamed. So she is not safe after all. You see, Armitage, the law must have its course. Absence is as good as flight. The settlement lapses. You are undone. Holmes's voice cracked like a whip. And so are you, Mr. Blount. At his signal, the closet door burst open, revealing myself and Lestrade together. From below, constables rushed up. Blount started back, his composure gone, his face a mask of fury and fear. You overreach yourself, sir, he stammered. You cannot prove— On the contrary, Holmes cut in, we can prove all. Your carpentry, your hirelings, your scheme to make absence serve as desertion. The lady's testimony, the crate, the tally card, the fiscs in custody, each speaks against you. You betrayed yourself the moment you recognized the mirror's trick. Blount's cane clattered to the floor. He sagged as if a cord had snapped, while Lestrade's men closed in. Julia, her strength returning with triumph, straightened in Percy's arms. Holmes folded his hands, the faintest smile upon his lips. Watson, he murmured, our mirror has indeed shown a face at last. Not the bride's, but the betrayer's. The room seemed to hold its breath as Lestrade's men closed about Septimus Blount. His narrow face twitched, lips working as if some final argument might still be marshalled from the ruins of his composure. Holmes regarded him with the detached curiosity of a naturalist who has pinned a rare insect and waits for the fluttering to cease. You are in error, Blount managed at last, his voice sharp with desperation. Nothing has been proved. You have theatrics, Mr. Holmes, nothing more. A pane that shifts, a recess in an old wall. These prove only eccentric carpentry. The law will see through your melodrama. Holmes lifted the tally card recovered from the crate and held it up to the light. The law, sir, will see dates, initials, and evidence of preparation. It will hear the testimony of a young lady abducted from her bridal chamber. It will learn of the fiscs, whose tongues will wag the moment they smell freedom. And it will observe your own tongue, which in this very room betrayed its knowledge of her supposed absence before it was spoken by another. No jury in England will fail to read the truth. Blount lunged as if to snatch the card, but two constables seized his arms. His cape slipped, revealing a waistcoat of fine cut within which protruded a sheaf of documents. Holmes plucked them with a surgeon's precision. Ah, he said, scanning the first page. Here is the marriage settlement itself, remarkably redrafted to omit the bride should she fail to appear by noon this day. And here, a draft conveyance of certain Redmayne properties to an unnamed trustee, doubtless yourself under disguise. So your greed has led you into artistry, but you have painted your forgery too boldly. Percy, who until now had stood trembling with rage, broke free of Julia's hold and confronted the lawyer. You would have ruined her name, stolen her fortune, and cast her aside like refuse. You black-hearted scoundrel. He raised his fist, but Holmes's hand intercepted with a speed that belied his calm. No, Mr. Armitage, violence is the resort of the weak. Let us leave him to the violence of his own designs collapsing. Julia clung to Percy's arm, her voice steadier now. I knew there was some force against me, some hidden hand. Uncle Ephraim was he too in this plot. Holmes inclined his head. He provided the contrivance of the mirror, though whether knowingly or under persuasion remains to be seen. My belief is that he lent his skill in exchange for coin, blind to its application. But he will answer to the magistrate. Blount, however, was the brain. He saw that a bride's disappearance, timed precisely, could alter the disposition of a fortune. He required only instruments and muscle to enact it. That, alas for him, is where my craft excels, in tracing the unseen string that binds them. Lestrade, flushed with triumph, could not refrain from a crow. A neat case, Holmes, a very neat case. I shall take him to the yard at once. The credit, Holmes interrupted coldly, is the lady's survival. Take your prisoner. Do not let him wriggle through some technicality, or I shall consider you an accomplice. And, Lestrade, remember, the mirror remains in my keeping until the trial. Do not permit it to vanish into some evidence room where moth and dust do the law's work for it. Blount was dragged away, his protests dwindling upon the stair. The door closed and silence fell once more upon the chamber. Holmes, with a sudden weariness, dropped into the nearest chair and stretched his long legs toward the fire. The faintest smile ghosted his lips as he watched Percy and Julia cling together. There is your case, Watson, he murmured. As pretty a problem of motive, means, and misdirection as one could wish for a winter's evening. A mirror that swallows a bride, a solicitor who feeds upon absence, and a fortune nearly lost to a quibble of time. One can almost admire the neatness of the design, were it not so vile. Julia knelt beside him, her voice trembling. "Mr. Holmes, I owe you more than I can ever speak. What may I do to thank you?" He waved a hand almost irritably. "Marry, madam, and live. That will be gratitude enough." Percy drew her to her feet. "Then we shall do so without delay. My mother must reconcile herself, for I shall not hazard a second abduction." Holmes's brows lifted a fraction. "See that you keep fewer lilies in your house, Mr. Armitage. Their scent masks too much. And a mirror. I'll place it where it reflects only the sun. It is a safer image." The household stirred about us, whispers running along the corridors, the weight of scandal shifting to awe. Lady Armitage entered at last, pale and severe. She opened her mouth, perhaps to censure, but her eyes fell upon Julia, alive, resolute, her hand firm in Percy's, and the words withered upon her lips. She inclined her head stiffly to Holmes. "Sir, it seems you have preserved my family from ruin. For that I must extend my thanks, though my heart is not softened." Holmes inclined his head in return, neither humbled nor affronted. "The truth, madam, is seldom soft. It is iron. Whether one likes its touch or not is immaterial." She withdrew, leaving us in the hush that follows storm. Julia turned to me with a smile, fragile but radiant. "Dr. Watson, will you stand with us when we speak our vows?" I stammered my assent, deeply moved. Holmes closed his eyes, his mouth curving in faint amusement. "Watson is witness, very fitting. He has witnessed all else in this curious tale. The fire crackled, the lilies drooped, and outside the city rumbled on, unaware of the drama played within these walls." I looked at Holmes, at his lean figure reclined in languid triumph, and marveled again at the strange genius of the man, cold yet compassionate, arrogant yet indispensable. He opened his eyes and met mine. "Do not look so astonished, my dear fellow. It was never more than a matter of trifles. The dust on a glove, the smell of orris, the hinge of a mirror. But trifles, when arranged, form a chain strong enough to hang a villain. Now, if you would be so good, the Persian slipper lacks tobacco, and I must replenish, and with that, the great case of the bride's glass passed from peril into memory, leaving me, as ever, astonished at the breadth of his deductions and the depth of his humanity, however much he sought to deny it. The days that followed were filled with a kind of strained quiet, as though the city itself waited to hear whether justice would stride forward or falter. Holmes, however, betrayed little interest in the gossip that spread through Mayfair and the courts. He withdrew once more to Baker Street, where the bride's glass now leaned against the wall near the fireplace, shrouded in a cloth like a corpse awaiting burial. On the second evening after Blount's arrest, I found him in his chair with his pipe unlit, his long fingers steepled, and his gaze fixed upon the mirror's draped outline. He had scarcely spoken through supper, and when at last I pressed him for his thoughts, he stirred only enough to murmur, "The play is not ended, Watson. The villain bows, but the curtain has not yet dropped." I asked if he doubted the evidence already in hand. "The crate, the tally card, the fisks ready to turn King's evidence." "No," he replied, eyes narrowing. "The evidence is ample, but I have learned that when a mind of Blount's cunning is cornered, it seeks not only escape, but revenge. He will have hidden some card, some final stratagem to cast confusion upon the trial. The law moves ponderously, my dear fellow, and a skilful hand may slip chains upon its feet. I do not doubt that even now he prepares." His words proved prescient. The following morning Lestrade arrived, flushed and troubled. Blount, it appeared, had refused to speak save to demand immediate counsel. His associates at the firm claimed ignorance of his dealings. More troubling still, Ephraim Redmayne had vanished. His warehouse was shuttered, his men dispersed, and no trace of him remained in Millbank Court. Holmes listened without surprise. The tradesman bolts the instant his patron is unmasked. But mark me, Lestrade, he will not flee far. His livelihood binds him to London, and Blount's schemes will rot without his testimony. If we trace the flow of glass, we shall find the man as surely as a fish is traced to water. He dispatched me that afternoon to certain dealers near Holborn, while he himself went prowling among the ecclesiastical furnishers of Clerkenwell. When we met again in the evening, I found him invigorated, his eyes alight. "As I thought," he said, "Redmayne's goods are his snare. A shipment of stained panes was due for the chapel of St. Olave's, yet never arrived. Instead, A curious crate of unusual weight was deposited at a warehouse near the river. The overseer believed it contained marble fonts. "Watson, what if our fugitive hides not among men but among his own cargo?" We went at once, Lestrade in tow. The warehouse keeper, half reluctant under police authority, led us to the rear where the suspect crate stood. Holmes examined its seams, sniffed at the joints, and with a swift motion of his knife prized back a slat. Within, crouched amid straw, his beard wild and his eyes haunted, was Ephraim Redmayne. He was pulled forth trembling, too cowed to resist. Holmes regarded him with no triumph, only a kind of weary contempt. "There is your craftsman, Lestrade. He knows the mirror's secret better than any. Press him, and he will give you Blount's full design." The old man broke at once, babbling of payments pressed into his hand, of promises that Julia would be restored unharmed once certain signatures were void. "I meant no evil," he wept. "I built what I was asked, no more. The lawyer said it was only to frighten her from the match, that she would be safe until the hour passed." Holmes cut him short. "You built a coffin and called it a cupboard. Spare us your innocence. You will answer before the magistrate." With Redmayne secured, the case seemed locked tight. Yet that night, as I prepared to retire, Holmes surprised me by rousing himself from his chair and pacing the room. "There remains the question of motive in its purest form," he said. "Why such elaborate deception when simpler fraud might have sufficed? It was not merely wealth that Blount sought, but control. With Julia removed from the board, he might wield her fortune to bind the Redmayne interests into his own. And here is the rub, Watson. Such men seldom labor for themselves alone. There may be another hand, wealthier, more shadowed, that employed Blount as agent. Until I see the trial concluded, I cannot rest easy. True enough, when Blount was brought before the magistrate a week later, the court was packed. Julia, pale but steadfast, testified with quiet dignity. Percy stood beside her, a pillar of loyalty. The Fisks, sullen but broken, confessed to their part, and Ephraim, his shoulders bent, admitted his share in the contrivance. All pointed to Blount as the mind that had orchestrated the scheme. Yet Blount, though fettered, retained his lawyer's tongue. He spoke at length of persecution, of coincidences twisted to look like crimes, of tradesmen's inventions he had never sanctioned. And then he struck where he knew the knife might slip deep. He insinuated that Julia herself had been complicit, that she had plotted a disappearance to free herself of the match, and now sought to cloak her guilt in accusation. A murmur rippled through the court. Julia's cheeks flamed. Percy half rose in outrage. But Holmes, who sat beside me, leaned forward like a hawk upon its perch. When the magistrate pressed for Blount's proof, the man produced a letter, folded and worn, purporting to be in Julia's hand, speaking of regret and desire for freedom. Gasps filled the chamber. The letter bore her signature, or one forged to it, and the date was that very morning of the wedding. For an instant it seemed the tide might turn. Lestrade muttered an oath. Percy's hand trembled. Julia swayed. But Holmes rose, calm as stone. "Permit me, your worship," he said, "to examine this paper." He held it delicately, his lens flicking across the strokes. Then, before the crowded room, he laid it flat and struck it once with the butt of his hand. A faint haze of powder lifted. "Gentlemen," he declared, "this letter is no lady's. It is the child of a solicitor's desk. The ink is fresh, not 3 days old, but scarcely 12 hours. See here." The signature runs across the grain of paper already creased. It was appended after the fold. "And note this. Upon the margin, grains of pumice such as clerks use to dry ink in haste. Miss Redmayne never wrote this. It was contrived while she lay captive." The magistrate peered, the court murmured approval, and Blount's last card shriveled to ash. His protest was drowned beneath the gavel's rap. Holmes returned to his seat, his lips tightening in the ghost of a smile. "The curtain falls now, Watson, and though the villain rails, the play is ended." Thus the bride's glass, which had hidden a bride, at last revealed the truth entire. And as Julia left the court upon Percy's arm, the mirror's spell was broken, its deceit laid bare by the one man who could make trifles tell their tale. The crowd that spilled from the magistrate's court buzzed with excitement, their voices weaving a tapestry of rumour and admiration. Julia Redmayne, her veil drawn close against curious eyes, leaned on Percy's arm as they hastened to the waiting carriage. Holmes, however, did not join the throng. He stood a little apart beneath the portico, his gaze lifted not to the people, but to the grey sky, as though searching for some sign in the shifting clouds. I recognized the look well. It was not satisfaction but vigilance, the expression of a man who hears an echo no one else perceives. We returned to Baker Street in silence. Only when the door closed behind us and the familiar clutter of our sitting room embraced us did Holmes permit himself to speak. "The trial concludes one chapter, Watson, but the volume is not yet shut. Blount is finished, yes, but he hinted at another. Did you not hear it?" I frowned, recalling the torrent of words the disgraced solicitor had hurled in his defense. He spoke of persecution, of enemies hidden, but I took it for the bluster of a drowning man. Holmes shook his head, drawing the cloth once more from the bride's glass. The cracked surface caught the firelight, its web of lines glowing faintly like frozen lightning. He spoke not to the magistrate but to someone else, someone he believed was listening. I know the tone, Watson. It was not despair, but a message smuggled through accusation. There is a hand yet unrevealed, one that employed Blount as tool. Mark me, before this mirror is consigned to oblivion, that hand will stir. His prophecy found confirmation sooner than I liked. 2 nights later, while we sat together, Holmes with his violin idle across his knees, myself perusing the evening paper, there came a knock at the street door. Mrs. Hudson ushered in a messenger, a ragged boy who bore a small parcel addressed to Holmes. He departed before questions could be asked. Holmes opened the package with care. Inside lay a scrap of mirror, its edges jagged, its back painted black. Upon the glass surface, written in some greasy substance, was a single phrase: "The bride was only the beginning." I confess a chill passed through me. Holmes examined it without visible alarm, though his eyes sharpened. "So," he murmured, "our hidden patron acknowledges defeat and promises another game. Watson, conceal this fragment. It is both threat and clue. Whoever sent it has access to Redmayne's stock, for the backing paint is of his mixture. But the writing, that is more intriguing." Her hand disguised, yet not beyond recovery. The following morning Lestrade arrived, weary but triumphant. "Blount will not see daylight for many years," he announced. "Between the Fisk's confession and Redmayne's cowardice, the case is iron. I thought you'd be pleased, Mr. Holmes. Holmes gave him a thin smile and passed him the shard of glass. "Pleased, Lestrade? I am never pleased until the last echo dies. Take this to the yard. Guard it as you would the crown jewels. If harm should come to Miss Redmayne or her fortune, remember that you were warned." Lestrade looked puzzled, muttered something about Holmes seeing phantoms, and took his leave. Holmes watched him go with that peculiar expression of mingled pity and disdain. "The yard never learns," he said. "They net the fish and forget the shadow in the water." In the days that followed, Percy and Julia came once more to Baker Street. Their gratitude was deep and genuine, though Holmes met it with a brusque nod and a retreat into abstraction. Julia, her ordeal behind her, had regained colour and composure, though her eyes still flickered toward the mirror shrouded in the corner. "Will it ever cease to haunt me?" she asked softly. Holmes regarded her with unexpected gentleness. "Objects have no souls, madam. It is we who breathe phantoms into them. Let the mirror stand as witness, not spectre. It testified against your betrayer when men would have doubted your word. That is its final use. Percy swore they would marry at once and carry her away from the city's whispers. Holmes approved. A wise course. Distance is the one solvent for scandal. But remember, wealth invites pursuit. Guard your household well. That evening, when they had gone, I ventured to press Holmes. Do you suspect still, though all the threads seem gathered?" He was silent for a time, then said, "Threads, yes, but threads may bind one tapestry to another. Consider, Watson. Blount was a man of law, Redmayne a craftsman, the Fisks mere river thieves, yet they acted in concert with precision. Such variety does not coalesce without design. There is a larger loom. Blount hinted as much with his dying words in court. I cannot say when the pattern will reveal itself, but when it does, it will not be the bride alone at hazard. Until then we watch. I asked what of the mirror. He rose, took it in both hands and set it face outward against the mantelpiece. Its fractured surface caught our reflections, his tall, gaunt figure beside my solid frame, both distorted into eerie semblance. "Let it remain," he said quietly. "It is well that we see ourselves distorted now and again. It reminds us that truth, though hidden, lies behind the glass, awaiting the moment it is turned. Thus ended, for the world at least, the affair of the bride's glass. For Percy and Julia, it was the prologue to their union. For Lestrade, it was another feather in his cap. But for Holmes it was a door half open, a mystery not yet concluded, its shadow stretching forward into nights yet to come. And for myself, well, I confess I felt once more that mingled awe and unease which every case left in its wake. To walk beside Sherlock Holmes was to dwell always in the space between light and darkness, where the smallest trifle might betray the greatest villainy, and where even the reflection of a bride could conceal a crime. Holmes had let the matter lie for several weeks, though I knew his mind never truly left it. The fragment of glass with its menacing scrawl rested in a drawer, and the bride's glass itself remained in our sitting room, shrouded but not discarded, as if he wished to remind himself that its chapter was unfinished. One damp morning in January, however, he roused me with a briskness that told me the final knot had come to hand. "A letter from the Home Office, Watson," he said, waving the paper. "It seems our friend Blount has written from prison, protesting his conviction with all the ingenuity of a trapped fox. Yet in his fury he names a benefactor, one whose shadow I suspected from the first. The true architect has slipped into the light." The name, when he spoke it, was not unfamiliar. A wealthy financier with fingers in half the city's enterprises, and known for his piety as much as his ruthlessness. He had long provided funds to the Redmayne Trust, and Blount had been but his solicitor of convenience. The abduction had been no mere scheme of greed, but a calculated effort to bind Julia's inheritance into his control, silencing her independence by removing her altogether from the marriage contract. "We could not prove it at the trial," Holmes said, "but Blount's own malice has furnished the rope. The man will be stripped of his honours quietly, his holdings scattered, though the world will call it a financial collapse rather than villainy. So it is with such men. The law seldom names them what they are, but justice comes in another tongue." I asked if Julia and Percy were safe now. Holmes allowed himself a rare smile. "They are abroad, happily wed, and with their fortune intact. No mirror will trouble them again." The true mirror, Watson, was Blount himself, reflecting not love or loyalty, but the law's cold face turned into a weapon. It has cracked, and through the fracture the truth has shone. That evening, as the fog pressed against the panes and the fire glowed low, Holmes removed the cloth from the bride's glass. He studied its fractured surface a moment, then, with a sudden motion, carried it to the hearth and let it fall. The shards scattered with a chime like frozen bells, the painted backing flaking into dust. "An end," he said simply. The object served its part, but no tool of deceit should outlive its detection. I could not help but protest at the destruction of so singular an artifact, but Holmes only waved his hand. "Better broken here than whole in some collector's chamber, whispering legends to credulous ears. Let its story live in your notes, Watson. That is monument enough." So it was that the case of the bride's glass closed not with scandal or blood, but with a quiet firelit evening in Baker Street, the villain unmasked, the lovers restored, and the strange mirror reduced to fragments on the hearth. Holmes, stretched in his chair, blew a thin plume of smoke toward the ceiling and remarked, with that peculiar modesty, which was only another shade of pride, "It was never more than a puzzle of trifles, the dust of Orris, the turn of a key, a hinge concealed. But from trifles, Watson, one may rebuild a world, and I, as so often before, marveled that from the smallest shards my friend had pieced together a truth large enough to rescue a bride. Confound a villain, and remind me once more that beneath the cold precision of his genius there lurked, however deeply buried, the quiet satisfaction of justice served.